It's so important to recognise the individuals here who have actually shaped, not necessarily the content of conversations, but the different type of conversations. And Richard's voice has been really very, very instrumental in changing the conversations that we have, and certainly his work within the MUT has been really quite hugely significant in shifting an organisation, not just to engage in the policy, create a policy, but to put that policy into practice throughout the schools around the country. And I think that that is no mean feat, to engage with an organisation like this and actually be significantly influential. And that's at the UK level. Richard has also, I think, been sort of given the description of the Alan Whittaker of the inclusion movement, because he has travelled extensively from the highlands of Papua New Guinea to the lowlands of Hackney, conveying a message and engaging in a different conversation, because the whole thrust of inclusive education is not just about the locality. It is global. It is global. And Richard, probably more than most, has been instrumental in that global reach and making the connection between that which is global and that which is local. And he's got 20 minutes only to tell us how he's done that. Richard.
Thanks, Joe. Well, I'm going to start with what I did last week. First of all, I edited this film which I produced because I got fed up with the backlash towards inclusion, the current coalition government's view on it, to go out and look to find schools. One is Wroxham, but I'm not going to show you that as you've heard that. Another is Emerson's Green in South Gloucestershire. I'm just going to show you a clip of this. We'll show more of these films after lunch while the PI AGM is still going on. They'll also be out on the website. The other thing I was doing last week was writing a position paper for the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is meeting in Geneva on the 15th of April, to redefine Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, a highly influential document that I've been involved in now for 10 years, but which is being wrongly interpreted by most state governments around the world, and it needs tightening up. So the meeting on the 15th of April is crucial, and one that I've been campaigning for 3 years. So I'm very pleased that that is now taking place. So just to start then, a little bit of this film, and then I'll go into what I wanted to say.
And the local authority wanted the school to have a real face for children with physical disability or vision impairment. So the school was built with that in mind, but very much as part of the school. And the specialist provision is really the extra staffing and specialist staff who support those children in class.
At the very beginning, we talked about what we wanted for their school, and one of the things that came out that was really, really important to everyone was around equal opportunities and everybody having the right to a decent education. It wasn't about including children and just being the resource-based children, it was about including every single child and thinking about what every child in this school needed so that they had the best opportunities to achieve and succeed in the wider aspects of school life, not just academically.
Most schools have a resource base which is actually a base that would be somewhere on site. All of our children are fully included into mainstream. One thing I found in a SEN setting was that as much as it was lovely and the children were well looked after, they weren't necessarily pushed to their full potential. And that's one thing that I looked at in school. Every child is thought individually, they're not classed as high in middle or lower ability, and it's trying to push them on their individual journey. We have something called building, applying, and extending. So our children work at the level that they think they're at. The teachers will, very, very discreetly go and push them on. So it's very, very strategic how teachers manage those lessons. because this school has from the very beginning been set up to think about how to include everybody, I think the children also adopt that and understand that.
In class is that he has a teaching assistant who adapts whatever the other children are doing to suit Matthew. So he uses an app on the iPad to write his sentences, which are then printed out, so that there's some way of getting what's in Matthew's head out, so that he can be assessed like the other children, or he can express himself.
We normally try to plan a meeting in the early part of the week with the teacher, the inclusive teacher also, any relevant TAs in the class, because it's not just the also TAs or the SEN TAs. We all come together, we read over the plans, and then we make suggestions as to how we might modify the lessons that are coming up to suit the child that we're working with. It brings the subject to life for staff. It gives the teacher an insight into what we're hoping to achieve with the children and also what she wants from the children.
I think it's a really supportive place to work, and I think that inclusion doesn't just apply to the children, I think it's the whole staff as well, and that it's very supportive and people look out for each other and the problem solved together. As a governing body, we view inclusion as a very high priority. Whichever issue that we're discussing as a body, the inclusion element is very high on our priority list, and we look at that first. All the major school events, things like whole school trips, individual class trips, residential trips, they just planned from the outset that everyone can be involved and included.
That gives you a flavour. I'll show more of it at 2 o'clock. Okay, so what I wanted to say really, thinking back 25 years ago, last Monday, which was the 16th of the month, it was a Friday when we had it, and the dying elements of the ALLFIE were there. We look a bit younger then, aren't we? Neil Fletcher, the leader of the authority, David Mallon, who went on to be CEO of East Sussex, and I think this is the wrong one, sorry. I'll keep going. There's like 2 slideshows, and I've got the full slideshow, which isn't the one I want to. Right, I'll keep talking. So David Mallon, East Sussex, and then we had a whole number of people, some of whom are here today. That's it. Technical issues. And really, Michelin has already said how this sort of came about, but I think I wasn't just put in there as a sensible teacher. I've been seconded because I was an awkward person. I've been the leader of the union in Inner London, and also chair of the joint ILA GLC asbestos committee. And what the problem was, they didn't know what to do with me, and so they seconded me, and after winning a grievance, and I became a researcher. They said, what do you want to look at? I said, I want to look at how you treat disabled teachers. They said, oh, well, you can't do that. You can look at how we deal with disability in the curriculum. So I've been working in this area. On these display boards at the side is some of the work that we did in the precursor to the book. Much of this work was done in my partner school, Susie Barrows, a school that no longer exists. The Burnham School in Hackney is now an academy on the site. You don't know how you can get a secondary academy on a primary school site, but you can do anything these days because there are no rules about what can be a school. And so that work went into the book, and when I met Michelin, as she said, it was a huge conversation. I had been a good left-wing trade unionist, and actually when the inspectorate in Inner London had said with the Fish report we should shut all special schools, the union had said, no, this is a time of cuts with Mrs Thatcher, and we can't have that. And so I suppose they thought I was a bit of a break on it, but I have to say Michelin converted me, and I became an inclusionist from those discussions, and I've championed that ever since. And it's more important to challenge oppressions than to worry about so on, while we can, of course, safeguard some of those. So we've got left with this book that the ILEA hadn't time to distribute. We had 3,000 copies, so they went to an old toilet in the Teachers' Centre in Hackney, where I was based as the teacher for disability, and we had various arrangements. Gus was the director at that time, and I was allowed to sell this book around the country. I had a parent who shipped them out, and after a while it became obvious that there were lots of people wanting this book, but they wanted the training that went with it. So we set up a charity called Disability, Equality and Education. And these were the aims of it: to train, to develop disabled people to be trainers, to empower the lives of young people, to act as change consultants, to develop resources, and to support development internationally. Well, it took 5 years before we could really get any money, and with the Labour government coming in, committed to inclusion, adopting the Salamanca Statement, it became possible to actually get funding for this charity from Jackie Smith, who was Minister at that time, and we actually did quite a lot of money from the government to train up disabled people to be trainers to work in schools. And we did reach 120,000 teachers through that method, which I think hasn't been achieved by any other sort of training that's happened. We wrote all sorts of course books. When the law changed, which from the campaigning side was that the SEN Disability Act, which came, Amendment Act, which came in 2001, was implemented in 2002, so we were providing a lot of that training. At the same time, it was necessary to develop internationally, and we got involved with, or I particularly got involved with the UN Convention discussions going on in New York, when the draft Article 17 said there should be an absolute choice between special school and mainstream school, and this is going to be what should be there across the world. And clearly that was wrong. It didn't fit with the principles that we were built into disability equality, what the movement was saying very strongly. And so we went and argued, and in fact there were 3 very crucial debates with state parties, and this was a unique treaty-making process in that the NGOs, the DPOs, Disabled People's Organisation, had an equal voice, and we really shaped what came out of that convention. It should have been stronger, but there were different views within the disability community itself, particularly the blind and deaf community, still not at that time won to mainstream schools. They are now internationally, they're not in every corner of the world. It's had an enormous impact. 159 countries ratified, 152 ratified, 159 signed up. This means they are committed to developing an inclusive education system throughout their country, as well as all other disability rights. I was privileged by actually previous General Secretary here, Steve Sinnott, introduced me to someone at a comic relief party to someone at the Commonwealth, they said, I said, well, I could write you a handbook. This is the 2nd edition on implementing this article, and that has gone around the world, and the position has improved on ratification now across the Commonwealth, although it was lagging behind. And so that's sort of led to a whole lot of international work that I did. But when this government came in, it seemed to me, from the Coalition Equality Statement, if you read it, there was no mention of disability in it, for starters, and it was clear from their policies that they were going to attack the gains of disabled people over the last 40 years. And so Sue Saunders, who runs the LGBTQ History Month, as it's called now, said, isn't it about time we had a disability history month? I said, well, yeah, arguably. So we did set one up, and it was founded, and we looked at inclusion as the first theme in 2010, then the struggles, changing lives, changing times, hate crime in 2012, celebrating our struggle for independent living, and this last year we looked at war and impairment, and this coming year, portrayal and disability. Now that's acted as a counterpole, really, to bring back the struggle, because a lot of people have spoken at events that we've had, and we've started, I think, working with the new upsurge like DIPAC and so on, Disabled People Against the Cuts. Now, in preparing this, what I'm saying internationally, I did some work for UNICEF 2 years ago about preparing teachers for children with disabilities. It's a piece of international research that I did for 2 years with them. And what came out from that was that despite education for all as the key thing that governments were going to, that disabled children seem to be being ignored in that push for educating everybody. And that actually, after 10 years of education for all, there were more children, as a proportion of children out of school who were disabled than any other group. And so I analysed the analysis that was going on, and there had been a big shift from UNESCO and UNICEF in the 90s, focusing on inclusion around disability, to a wider shift, which I think was linked to authors of the Index for Inclusion who wanted to make it wider and were advising UNESCO that we shouldn't focus on disabled people just. Now the problem is we have specific issues, and if those are not focused on and people are just trained generally for inclusion, then they are not trained to include disabled people. And so my proposal to the UN was that we needed a twin-track approach in training all teachers. Yes, general inclusion, what we really were training when all those teachers were trained, but it wasn't working because people didn't have the specific knowledge, and so there were only these few people who were trained for that. And that didn't work. We have to have all teachers trained to be able to actually accommodate, make reasonable accommodations. And so the other thing was the lack of political will and the lack of involvement of disabled people's organisations. Last year we did some work in South Sudan, probably the most difficult place to do work on inclusion, but we were charged in World of Inclusion to write the plan for the government for implementing inclusion. So we wanted to find out what the attitudes were, and we trained up and had researchers working in 58 schools in 9 districts. And we interviewed the children, the parents, the teachers, the head teachers and the officials. And this is quite interesting. In a place where there is no inclusion, this was the aspiration of everybody. They wanted inclusion. We did something else to back this up, whether it was just a fluke. We showed matched photographs of segregated provision and inclusive provision in an African context. And people had to choose which one they wanted. And again, overwhelmingly, they chose the inclusive provision. And that was very important because when we engaged with the ministry, they said, well, we were all trained in special needs, so surely we need separate schools. And it took a long battle with people in the ministry to say, no, you can't afford it, and anyway it doesn't work, so why don't we have one system? So they are now committed to one system, not that they've moved very far on it. So what are the key barriers? Well, looking around the world, the education reform movement, or reform movement of education, is the biggest barrier, because this is about privatising education, making profit out of education. It is a consistent movement. Organisations like Pearson's Publishers, Michael Barber, are key runners in pushing this forward. They want the curriculum privatised, they want it sold, it isn't a right anymore, and where we've got briefing, sorry, I'm silent, right? Speaking of, I'll just bring my remarks to a conclusion now. So the education reform movement is not reform, it's reaction, and that needs to be fought against. There is no evidence that free schools and academies in this country have done better for all children, and there is certainly much evidence that they have done much worse for disabled children than standard schools. So we need to really politically, as we run up to the election, get commitments from politicians to reverse that. At the moment, only the Left Unity is the only party that's committed to reversing that. The Greens are quite a long way along that, but Labour, Liberal and Tory want to continue with the privatisation. It is the destruction of education that destroys the chance of inclusion. We want, as Alison said, we want collaboration, not competition. We have to train our teachers differently so that they are adequate, but we also have to train them so they can think for themselves, not programmed to deliver some sort of Machiavellian curriculum devised by Mr. Gove. We lack disaggregated data of disabled children around the world, and we can't hold state parties to account till they measure that, and they have to do it. We lack the involvement of disabled people all over the world in the education system. So the model that Micheline and me developed, we need to develop again across the world, and that means seeing the centrality of the involvement of disabled people in actually challenging and changing. And looking back at this book when it came out, book reviews, there were a couple of book reviews that drew my attention to. One by John Quick at Sheffield and another by Gary, I forget his other name, he worked with you, Mark, for a long time, Gary Thompson. Both of which begrudgingly said, well, not Gary Box, the guy who was at Oxford and then went to Birmingham, Gary Thomas, thank you. he did a review in the TS and said, well, there's some nuggets and diamonds in amongst this, amongst a whole load of rubbish, is how he described the book. John Quick did similar things. Well, I think we've proved that what we were saying is right. The world has adopted the paradigm shift, it is adopted in world law. These people who are leading special education needs are now the outliers of reaction. They still need to be challenged. They are still training people in a completely the wrong way to go into schools. But, you know, that SEN establishment has a long, deep grip. We, on purpose, when we drafted the convention, didn't mention special education needs, we mentioned rights. We need to involve youth much more, and we need genuine parental control of these systems. So we lack clarity of this article. We hope to change that on the 15th of April. So I'll leave you with this thought, which we used in the summer school in 2001 and on a t-shirt for inclusion now, but I think it still is, there are more than enough people in this room to change the world. And I think that's what we need to remember. It never was more than a few people who ever changed anything. So if we can keep a network and keep going and share our experiences, we can, in the next period, maybe another 25 years, actually seeing a fully inclusive system around the world, or we can go to the destruction of the world. There's only that choice, really.